A felled seam is a very common technique on 18th and early 19th century shifts and shirts. It is a perfect seam to do on any kind of unlined garment. So be it historical sewing or potentially some sort of modern garment that it's unlined. This seam is done with a reverse backstitch in order to hold the fabric together, and then the raw edges are folded over and felled into place. To start this type of seam, you want to pin your fabric right sides together, and you want to stagger your fabric. So for example, with this seam, I want it to be 1/8 of an inch wide. For other seams, you might want it to be 1/4 of an inch wide. And then when it comes to the overall seam allowance that's taken up on this fabric and then on this fabric, you want to then double that number. So for example, I'm taking up 1/8 of an inch or a little bit over 3 millimeters. So then the total seam allowance taken up on this specific piece of fabric is going to be 1/4 of an inch or about 6.5 millimeters. Pin this together, and it's very important that when you're lining this up, that you're actually looking at the grain line of the under fabric and you're also looking at the grain line of the top fabric. So you want this line here to be perfectly straight and parallel with this line, and then it wants to run across one yarn all the way down the fabric so that your stitching line will be straight. So you can use pins and your fingers just to kind of gently wiggle these into place, and then I would temporarily pin that. Because it is such a delicate tiny seam, so I'm just going to baste right across where the pins are just to temporarily hold the fabric in place without having to worry about any kind of pins to catch on as I'm working. We're going to sew a reverse backstitch the same distance from this raw edge to this raw edge. So the stitching line will start 1/8 of an inch or about 3 millimeters from this raw edge because that's how wide I want my seam allowance to be. So if you need some help practicing your reverse backstitching, you can check out the tutorial on the reverse backstitch that really breaks down the steps. So if you are left-handed, you're going to be stitching right to left, and if you're right-handed, you're going to be stitching left to right. Go ahead and draw a line right here so that you can follow that nice and cleanly. I'm going to go ahead and eyeball it because I feel comfortable doing that, but it is definitely drawing a line can make your life easier. This seam is going to be stitched at 10 to 11 stitches per inch because I am basing this whole seam off of an original 19th century shirt. So I'm going to dip my needle a stitch width away from the raw edge. So I put my needle going towards the direction of that raw edge, and then my next stitch is going to be a stitch width away from this knot. So again, dipping down into the material and going back towards that knot, and you might come out on just on the other side of that knot. And I'm using my non-dominant hand to stabilize the fabric as I pull this through. So you want to pull it tight enough that it locks it in place, but not so tight that it ends up gathering up the fabric. And here I am I can see here how there's a little bit of an indent in the textile. And so that's indicating that that is the yarn that I want to then carry across the work. So you can see that the work itself will help to kind of indicate where that sewing is going to be. Again, dipping down my needle and going back to the stitch that was just made. You might go through the same stitching hole, or you might end up actually going a little bit to the other side of that hole. So there's a little bit of an overlap. It doesn't really matter. You just want to get into a rhythm as it relates to your stitching. I'm also keeping my tail between me and this needle. I also am keeping my needle parallel to me, not working perpendicular. And just like all the other sewing that I have taught, we're just going to dip that needle just a little bit into the fabric and then pop back up again. So we're not going to be moving our needle in any kind of really remarkable way. Now the other side of the work looks like this. So it's going to look like that back stitch that you would do from the front portion of the fabric. So we're just going to continue to do this along the length of our seam. I'm using my non-dominant hand to stabilize the work. You can see how I'm pinching it with my thumb and my middle finger. And then the hands are being stabilized by what's underneath them. So right now I've got the table underneath my hands, but it might be my lap or a pillow depending on how I'm working. And when you're ready to knot off, take a little bite in the material. Make a loop, go through that loop once or twice, pull it. And then this is going to be on the inside, so it doesn't matter, but I still like to take my needle and go back parallel between the thread and the fabric, and then trim off that. Now it's time to baste up this raw edge so that when we fold it up for a second time, there's a nice clean edge to fell over. So this is where this staggering really comes in handy, is that this is in essence created a gauge for you to fold this over top of. And then we're just gonna baste this fold over. And if you're right-handed, you're gonna work right to left, left-handed, left to right. So fold that over up to the stitching line, and you can kind of feel that fold kind of in the crease. And then you can just do kind of like a bigger running stitch just to baste it up temporarily. So we've got our seam basted up. Now is the part that sometimes people forget to do. You actually want to take the other portion of the fabric and you want to fold it towards you. So now you've got the wrong side actually looking up at you. And you want to make sure that you press this fold over. You also want to make sure that this seam line is very cleanly and crisply pressed open. With linen, you can easily do this with your fingers, but you may want to grab an iron and do it too. But it is vital that this is cleanly pressed open. Now it's time to fold that over and fell it in place. And if you think of felling, think about like felling a tree. You're knocking over a tree, so we're knocking over this clean edge to then stitch it down. Right-handed people are going to be doing right to left. Left-handed folks will do left to right. The reason why this fabric is here is because I'm actually sewing a seam on a gusset. So that's why you get extra. But if you were starting a seam at the end of the material, you would actually have this cut all the way up here. But this is the exact same technique that you would use for any kind of seaming. I'm going to put this needle in right along that edge, making sure that I'm only going down about a yarn or two. Put that needle through. Lock that knot in place. Orient the work so that it's parallel to your body. Make sure that your non-dominant hand is perpetually kind of pushing this seam open and then pressing this fold down. So my middle finger is pushing that open and my thumb is pressing this down. And you want to make sure that when you fold this over, that this grain line is going in the same direction as the grain line of the fabric you're felling the fold to. So to take my first stitch, I'm going to go into the fabric a little to the left of where this tail is, but in the fabric itself. Or if you're left-handed, you're going to put it just a little bit to the right of that tail, but slightly underneath the fold. Grab a little bit of the fabric and then push it into the fold. Again, only about a yarn away from that folded edge, and then push your needle through. So that creates a little tiny angled stitch. The needle is only slightly at an angle. If that's 90 degrees, that's 45. I would say it's probably about a 20-degree angle. And then we're going to do the same thing. Again, slightly to the left or to the right of this tail, a little bit below that fold, dipping just ever so slightly, dipping that needle down, then rocking it back up, going through the fold, pulling it in. If you need practice doing any kind of hemming or felling, I would recommend watching my hemming and felling tutorial. So you can start to see that seam coming together. This is what it looks like on the opposite side, a little tiny top stitch. Now once you've stitched to the end of the work, you're going to take another tiny little stitch in the outer fabric. You're going to make a loop. You're not actually going to finish that stitch, but make this loop and then put your needle through it once or twice. If you're using a heavier linen thread, once is going to be sufficient. And then pull that knot. And then you're going to put that needle back down through the fold, and then you can snip off this tail. And then that's going to make it look as though it is a stitch and not a knot. Now you can take your basting stitches out. Just grab those little tiny scissors. Those are great for this. So now you have a really nice interior of a felled seam. And by doing that reverse back stitch, now the interior actually has flat stitches that are somewhat lined up with one another and look a little bit cleaner. So when it's against the skin, it's not going to rub as much, or you're not as much as a risk for the stitches breaking. And then on the outside, you can see that that's the seam line. And then you have just some really nice top stitches from where you felled all the way through. Congratulations, you've practiced a seaming technique that is seen on original 19th century shirts. So you're carrying on a tradition and preserving a skill so that it doesn't die away, connecting you to the past so you can be more present so that we can stitch a better future.